Chapter 3, Part 5 and 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1 by John Bagnell. Chapter 3, Part 5. The Supremacy and the Decline of Argos, the Olympian Games. The rebellion of Messenia had been especially formidable to Sparta because the rebels had been supported by two foreign powers, Arcadia and Pisa. Part of Arcadia seems to have been united at this time under the lordship of the king of the Arcadian or Comnenus. The king of Pisa on the Alpheus had recently risen to newer power and honor with the help of Argos, and Argos itself had been playing a prominent part in the peninsula under the leadership of her king Phidon. The reign of this king was the last epoch of Argos as an active power of the first rank. We know little about him, but his name became so famous that in the later times the royal house of the distant Macedonia, when it reached the height of its success in Alexander the Great, was anxious to connect its line of descent with Phidon. Under his auspices, a system of measures was introduced to Argos and the Peloponnesus. These measures were called after his name Phidonian and were likewise adopted at Athens. They seem to have been closely connected with the Aeginetan system of weights, but the only clear action of Phidon is his expedition to the west. He led an Argive army across Arcadia to the banks of the Alpheus and presided there over the celebration of the Olympian festival, which is now for the first time heard of in the history of Greece. The Altus, or sacred grove of Olympia, lay under the wooded mount of Cronus, where the river Clydus flows into the Alpheus in the angle between the two streams. It was dedicated to the worship of Zeus, but the spot was probably sacred to Pelops before Zeus claimed it for himself, and Pelops, degraded to a rank of a hero, kept his own sacred precinct within the larger enclosure. The sanctuary was in the territory of Pisa, and it is possible that the care of the worship and the conduct of the festivals belonged originally to the Pisan community. But the men of Elis, northern neighbors of Pisa, set their hearts on having control of the Olympian sanctuary, which, though it is not once mentioned as Delphi and Dodona are mentioned in the poems of Homer, must by the 7th century have won a high prestige in the Peloponnesus and drawn many visitors. As Elis was stronger than Pisa, the Eleans finally succeeded in usurping the conduct of the games. Games were the chief feature of the festival, which was held every 4th year at the time of the second full moon after Midsummer's Day. The games at first included foot races, boxing and wrestling. Chariot races and horse races were added later. Such contests were an ancient institution in Greece. We know not how far back they go or in what circumstances they were first introduced, but the funeral games of Patroclus described in the Iliad permit us to infer that they were a feature of Ionian life in the 9th century. We can see but dimly into the political relations of Phidon's age. We can discern at least that Sparta lent her countenance to Elis in this usurpation, and that Argos, jealous of the growing power of Sparta, espoused the cause of Pisa. This was the purpose of King Phidon's expedition to Olympia. He took the management of the games out of the hands of Elis and restored it to Pisa. And for many years, Pisa maintained her rights. She maintained them so long as Sparta, absorbed in the Messenian strife, had no help to spare for Elis, and during that time she did what she could to help the foes of Sparta. But when the revolt was suppressed, it was inevitable that Elis should again, with Spartan help, win the control of the games, for Argos, declining under successors of Phidon, could give no aid to Pisa. When King Phidon held his state at Olympia, the most impressive shrine in the Altus was the temple of Hera and Zeus, and this is the most ancient temple of which the foundations are still preserved on the soil of Hellas. It was built of sun-baked bricks upon lower courses of stone, and the Doric columns were of wood. The days of stone temples were at hand, but it was not till 2 centuries later that the elder shrine was overshadowed by the great stone temple of Zeus. The temple of Hera is supposed by some to have been founded in the 11th or 10th century. It is hardly likely to be so old, but it was certainly very old, like the games of the place. The mythical institution of the games was ascribed to Pelops or to Heracles, and when the Eleans usurped the presidency, the story gradually took shape that the celebration had been revived by the Spartan Lycurgus and the Elean Iphitus in the year 776 BC, and this year was reckoned as the first Olympiad. From that year until the visit of Phidon, the Eleans professed to have presided over the feast, and their account of the matter won its way into general belief. It is possible that King Phidon reorganized the games and inaugurated a new stage in the history of the festival. At all events, by the beginning of the 6th century, the festival was no longer an event of the merely Peloponnesian interest. It had become famous wherever the Greek tongue was spoken, and when the feast tide came round in each cycle of 4 years, there thronged to the banks of Alpheus from all quarters of the Greek world athletes and horses to compete in the contest and spectators to behold them. During the celebration of the festival, a sacred truce was observed, and the men of Elis claimed that in those days their territory was inviolable. The prize of victory in the games was a wreath of wild olive, but rich rewards always awaited the victor when he returned home in triumph, and laid the Olympian crown in the chief temple of his city. It may seem strange that the greatest and the most glorious of all pan-Hellenic festivals should have been celebrated near the western shores of the Peloponnesus. One might have looked to find it nearer the Aegean, but situated where it was, the scene of the great games was all the nearer to the Greeks beyond the western sea, and none of the people of the mother country vied more eagerly or more often in the contests of Olympia than the children who had found new homes far away on Sicilian and Italian soil. This nearness of Olympia to the western colonies comes into one's thoughts when, standing in the sacred altis, one beholds the terrace of the northern side of the precinct and the scanty remains of the row of 12 treasure houses which once stood here. For those 12 treasuries, 5 at least were dedicated by Sicilians and Italian cities. Thus, the Olympian festival helped the colonies of the West to keep in touch with the mother country. It furnished a center where Greeks of all parts met and exchanged their ideas and experiences. It was one of the institutions which expressed and quickened the consciousness of fellowship among the scattered folks of the Greek race, and it became a model, as we shall see, for other festivals of the same kind, which concurred in promoting a feeling of national unity. The final success of Sparta in the long struggle with Messenia marks the period at which the balance of power among the Peloponnesian states began to shift. In the 7th century, Argos is the leading state. She has reduced Mycenae. She has annihilated Essene. She has made Tiryns an Argive fort. She has defeated Sparta at Hysia. There can be little doubt that Phidon's authority extended over all Argolis. Possibly, his influence was felt in the Aegina, and the Laconian islands of Cythera may have been an Argive possession, as well as the whole eastern coast of Laconia. But his reign is the last manifestation of the greatest of the southern Argos. 50 years after the subjugation of Messenia, the Spartans become the strongest state in the Peloponnesus, and the Argives sink into the position of a second-rate power. Always able to maintain their independence, always a thorn in the side of Sparta, always to be reckoned with as a foe and welcomed as a friend, but never leading, dominant, or originative. Part 6. Democratic movements, lawgivers and tyrants. It is clear that there is no security that equal justice will be meted out to all, so long as the laws by which the judge is supposed to act are not accessible to all. A written code of laws is a condition of just judgment, however just the laws themselves may be. It was therefore natural that one of the first demands of the people in Greek cities pressed upon their aristocratic governments, and one of the first concessions these governments were forced to make, was a written law. It must be borne in mind that in old days deeds which injured only the individual and did not touch the gods or the state were left to the injured person to deal with as he chose or could. The state did not interfere. Even in the case of bloodshedding, it devolved upon the kinsfolk of the slain man to wreak punishment upon the slayer. Then, as social order developed along with centralization, the state took justice partly into its own hands, and the injured man, before he could punish the wrongdoer, was obliged to charge him before a judge who decided the punishment. But it must be noted that no crime could come before the judge unless the injured person came forward as accuser. In case of bloodshedding was exceptional, owing to the religious ideas connected with it. It was felt that the shedder of blood was not only impure himself, but had also defiled the gods of the community, so that as a consequence of this theory, manslaughter of every form came under the class of crimes against the religion of the state. The work of writing down the laws and fixing customs in legal shape was probably, in most cases, combined with the work of reforming, and thus the great codifiers of the 7th century were also lawgivers. Among them the most famous were the misty figures of Zaleucus, who made laws for the western Locranes, and Chardonus, the legislator of Catane. The clearer figure of the Athenian Dracon, of whom more will be said hereafter, and most famous of all, Solon the Wise. But cities under the elder Greece had their lawgivers too, men of knowledge and experience. The names of some were preserved, but they are mere names. It is probable that the laws of Sparta herself, which she afterwards attributed to a god, were first shaped and written down at this period. The cities of Crete too were affected by the prevalent spirit of law shaping, and some fragments are preserved of the early laws of Gortyn, which were the beginning of an epoch of legislative activity, culminating in the Gortynian Code, which has come down to us on tablets of stone. In many cases, the legislation was accompanied by political concessions to the people, and it was part of the lawgiver's task to modify the constitution. But for the most part, this was only the beginning of a long political conflict. The people striving for freedom and equality, the privileged classes struggling to retain their exclusive rights. The social distress touched on in a previous chapter was the sharp spur which drove the people on in this effort towards popular government. The struggle was in some cases to end in the establishment of a democracy. In many cases, the oligarchy succeeded in maintaining itself and keeping the people down. In most cases, perhaps the result was a perpetual oscillation between oligarchy and democracy, an endless series of revolutions, too often sullied by violence. But though democracy was not everywhere victorious, though even the states in which it was most firmly established were exposed to the danger of oligarchical conspiracies, yet everywhere the people aspired to it. And we may say that the chief feature of the domestic history of most Greek cities from the end of the 7th century forward is an endeavor, here successful, yonder frustrated, to establish or maintain popular government. In this sense, when we have now reached a period in which the Greek world is striving and tending to pass from the aristocratic to the democratic commonwealth, the movement passed by some states like Thessaly, just as there had been some exceptions like Argos to the general fall of monarchies, while remote kingdoms like Macedonia and Molossia were not affected. As usually, or at least frequently happens in such circumstances, the popular movement received help from within the camp of the adversary. It was help indeed for which there was no reason to be grateful to those who gave it, for it was not given for the love of the people. In many cities, feuds existed between some of the power-holding families, and when one family was in the ascendant, its rivals were tempted to make use of the popular dissent in order to subvert it. Thus, discontented nobles came forward to be in the leaders of the discontented masses. But when the government was overthrown, the revolution generally resulted in a temporary return to monarchy. The noble leader seized the supreme power and maintained it by armed might. The masses of the people were not yet ripe for taking the power into their own hands, and they were generally glad to entrust it to the man who had helped them to overthrow the hated government of the nobles. This new kind of monarchy was very different from the old, for the position of the monarch did not rest on hereditary right but on physical force. Such illegitimate monarchs were called tyrants to distinguish them from the hereditary kings, and this form of monarchy was called a tyranny. The name tyrant was perhaps derived from Lydia and first used by Greeks in designating the Lydian monarchs. Archilochus, in whose fragments we first meet tyrannies, applied to the sovereignty of Jaij. The word in itself, morally neutral, did not imply that the monarch was bad or cruel. There was nothing self-contradictory in a good tyrant, and many tyrants were beneficent. But the isolation of these rulers, who being without the support of legitimacy depended on armed force, so often urged them to be suspicious and cruel that the tyrannies came into bad odor. Arbitrary acts of oppression were associated with the name, and tyrant inclined to the evil sense in which modern languages have adopted it. For the Greek dislike of the tyrannies, there was, however, a deeper cause than the fact that many tyrants were oppressors. It placed in the hands of an unconstitutional ruler arbitrary control, whether he exercised it or not, over the lives and fortunes of the citizens. It was thus repugnant to the Greek love of freedom, and it seemed to arrest their constitutional growth. As a matter of fact, this temporary arrest during the period when the first tyrannies prevailed may have been useful, for the tyrannies, though its direct political effect was retarding, forwarded the progress of the people in other directions, and even from a constitutional point of view, it may have had its uses at this period. In some cases, it secured an interval of repose and growth during which the people won experience and knowledge to fit them for self-government. The period which saw the fall of the aristocracies is often called the Age of the Tyrants. The expression is unhappy because it might easily mislead. The tyrannies first came into existence at this period. There was a large crop of tyrants much about the same time in different parts of Greece. They all performed the same function of overthrowing aristocracies, and in many cases they paved the way for democracies. But on the other hand, the tyrannies was not a form of government which appeared only at this transitional crisis and then passed away. There is no age in the subsequent history of Greece which might not see, and did not actually see, the rise of tyrants here and there. Tyranny was always with the Greeks. It, as well as oligarchy, was a danger by which the democracies were threatened at all periods. Ionia seems to have been the original home of the tyrannies, and this may have been partly due to the seductive example of the rich court of the Lydian tyrants at Sardis. But of the Ionian tyrannies we know little. We hear of factions and feuds in the cities, of aristocratic houses overthrown and despotisms established in various states. A tyrant of Ephesus marries the daughter of the Lydian monarch Aletes. The most famous of these tyrants was Thrasybulus of Miletus, under whose rule that city held a more brilliant position than ever. Abroad, he took part in planting some of the colonies on the Black Sea and successfully resisted the menaces of Lydia. At home, he developed the craft of tyranny to a fine art. In Lesbian Mytilene, we see the tyrannies and also a method by which it might be avoided. Mytilene had one great commercial prosperity. Its ruling nobles, the Pentelids, were wealthy and luxurious and oppressed the people. Tyrants rose and fell in rapid succession. The echoes of hatred and jubilation still ring to us from the relics of the lyric poems of Alcaeus. Let us drink and reel, for Marcellus is dead. The poet was a noble and a fighter, but in a war with the Athenians on the coast of the Hellespont, he threw away his shield like Archilochus, and it hung as a trophy at Sigeum. He plotted with Pittacus against the tyrant, but Pittacus was not a noble, and his friendship with Alcaeus was not enduring. Pittacus, however, who distinguished himself for bravery in the same war with Athens, was to be the savior of the state. He gained the trust of the people and was elected ruler for a period of 10 years in order to heal the sores of the city. Such a governor, possessing supreme power but for a limited time, was called Asymetes. Pittacus gained the reputation of a wise lawgiver and a firm, moderate ruler. He banished the nobles who opposed him, among those others the two most famous of all lesbians, the poets Alcaeus and Sappho. At the end of 10 years, he laid down his office to be enrolled after his death in the number of the 7 wise men. The ship of state had reached the haven, to apply a metaphor of Alcaeus, and the exiles could safely be allowed to return. This was a brilliant period of the history of Lesbos, and a few surviving fragments of its two great poets, who struck new notes and devised new cadences of lyrics, give a glimpse of the free and luxurious life of Aeolian islands. The radiant genius of Sappho was inspired by her passionate attachments to young lesbian maidens. The songs of Alcaeus, mirroring the commotions of party warfare, rang with the clatter of arms and the clinking of drinking cups. End of chapter 3, part 5 and 6.